Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Theory of Life podcast. We have John Bryden on once again, and we're doing something very, very special today. John, tell the audience what we're going to be doing today, please.
We are doing a devil's advocate debate on the existence of God. And Wade is going to be arguing for theism, and I am going to be arguing for atheism.
Yes, fantastic. Yeah, so we've been planning this for a little bit. We were going to have a moderator, but it didn't work out. So we're going to be moderating each other, and we're going to have opening statements, rebuttals, and then it's going to be a formal/informal/ whatever. And then we'll have an open dialogue. So I guess the question is, does God exist? Is that kind of a good way to frame the question? Or how would you want to frame the question? Is perfect being theism true? Would that be a...
Or we could say, I think that perfect being, I think God, if God exists, it would entail the truth of perfect being theism. And just to let the audience know, perfect being theism is a tradition for talking about God that says if God exists, God is omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent, omnibenevolent, all of the omnis.
Yeah.
And that's the concept of God that Wade and I are debating today. Does such a being? So when we say does God exist, we're talking about perfect being theism.
And and a side point that it will be relevant, and it might sound like out of the blue here, but I think it's important to know, like in perfect being theism, the omnis flow out of perfection, and that's going to be an important point that we're going to be discussing.
And another point for the audience, there are other debates that could be had about whether or not, a finite God exists, or whether or not an evil God exists, or whether or not something like pantheism exists. But we can't tackle all of the different theisms and divine in one podcast. So for the purposes of this podcast, we're going to go with the concept of God that is found in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, namely perfect being theism, which is, has all the omni attributes. So that's...
And also, side note before we get into it, this perfect being theism is not necessarily tied to a religion, right?
No.
Just
it's just commonly associated with Christianity, Islam, Judaism, because they all say they don't agree on things like the Trinity, but they'll say that God is omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent.
Yeah.
So, to your point, just so the audience knows, Wade isn't arguing for Christianity today, or Islam, or Judaism. He's just arguing, does God exist? Does God exist? God defined as omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, all the omnis. So
yes, and the final side note,
all the
caveats. John is not arguing for a lack of belief. He is arguing for
God does not exist. I'm arguing that God does not exist, or that at least it's probable that God doesn't exist. Yeah. So not any, a lack of belief in God. And I'm not going to make fun of those people either, because I think there is an interesting case about burden of proof, or an interesting conversation that goes beyond the scope of this podcast. So
yes, okay, so John's going to start, then I'm going to go, then he's going to rebut, then I'm going to rebut, and then we're going to talk, and then it's going to be cool. And then maybe at the very end, we're going to discuss what we think about the positions we're actually putting forward. So John, I'll leave it up to you. Ready?
All right. As Wade and I said, for the purpose of this discussion, we're defining God, or we're describing God as omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, omnibenevolent, or we'll use the definition that Saint Anselm gave as the greatest conceivable being, or as Alan Planiga would say, a maximally perfect being. So when I say God, or when Wade says God, think about a greatest conceivable being, or a maximally perfect being. With that out of the way, I want to get into my first argument. And so I want us all to imagine a world where God and only God exists in a state of perfect and undisturbed bliss. If such a world were to exist, it would be perfect, for it would only contain the ultimate source of truth, beauty, and goodness, namely God. A perfect world that exemplifies truth, beauty, and goodness would be the unique, best possible world. And we can call this world God world. And as philosopher Justin Schieber said, this is an amusement park where God lives. That's not what we're saying. It's the unique, best possible world where God and only God exists. If God world exists, God would maintain God world. Why? If God were to create, anything that's not him would be by necessity imperfect. Well, why? Only the greatest conceivable being can be perfect. Thus, any creation would be, by definition, necessarily imperfect. Thus, if God were to create, it would lead to the introduction of degradations into God world. A perfect being would not allow for degradations. Thus, if God exists, no creation should exist. But since we're considering this line of thought, it's obvious that God world does not exist. And with this in mind, I invite you to consider the following argument. If God exists, a creation would not exist. A creation exists, therefore God does not exist. And now I want to turn my attention to my second argument. Wade and I both agree that if God exists, he would be omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent. An omnibenevolent being would not leave human creatures in the dark on important issues such as origin, morality, meaning, and destiny. And if a being is omnipotent and omniscient, then he has the resources necessary to communicate clearly to humans about origin, morality, meaning, and destiny. And yet, we live in a world where all the major religions disagree on fundamental issues pertaining to origin, morality, meaning, and destiny. And it's not at all clear that any of these religions is true. In short, we live in a world that is religiously ambiguous. And with this in mind, consider the following argument. If God exists, religious ambiguity would not exist. Religious ambiguity exists, therefore God does not exist. It is my conviction that the existence of a creation and the existence of religious ambiguity serve as a reasonable evidence for the proposition God does not exist. I leave the floor to Wade.
Thank you so much, Mr. John. Okay, let me get my notes out right quick. Okay, I thought I had a somewhat structured Google Doc, but I suppose I did not. Okay, all right, so we got it here. Okay, so
Problem of evil once again.
the problem of evil once again. All right, here we go. So I'm going to set myself a timer right quick. Okay, so my position is that God exists, or perfect being theism is true. Now, we agreed to have two arguments. I was gonna kind of use a contingency argument, but I wasn't sure about some of the things there, so I'm gonna use two design arguments. And they're not really super common, but I like them. So anyway, and I'm gonna lay out the syllogism and then explain the premise after I lay out the syllogism. So the first argument I have is the reliability of cognitive faculties. So here's the syllogism. Human cognitive faculties are generally reliable. If human cognitive faculties are generally reliable, God exists, therefore God exists. And the conclusion follows logically there. So with premise one, human cognitive faculties are generally reliable. I hope we all kind of accept this. You don't have to say that they're always reliable. Sometimes, they might be giving us, false beliefs. I think I should define cognitive faculties here. Cognitive faculties, it would be eyesight, hearing, smelling, the five senses. And then you might have other senses about something else, maybe the moral realm or something else. These would be cognitive faculties. And presumably, these cognitive faculties are tracking with reality. When I look at the wall, there's a wall there, and I have justified belief, justified true belief, that there was a wall there. So, premise two, if human cognitive faculties are generally reliable, God exists. So, why think this is true? So, here's something about evolution. So, evolution seems to select for survival. It doesn't seem to select for true beliefs, justified true beliefs, or I guess beliefs at all. But, we can grant that evolution might select for some kind of beliefs, but why would it select for true beliefs? It seems as though the selection process can get off the ground without true beliefs. I can imagine our bodies adapting to their environments, but we don't have true beliefs in our mind. Imagine plants. Like, plants don't have minds, presumably, unless you have some strange view, which might be true. Who knows? But they adapt to their environment. and they don't have any true beliefs about reality. So it seems kind of weird that we do. So now you might say, well, there's some naturalistic explanation that we haven't discovered yet. And maybe that's true, but also maybe someone just designed it. And so it kind of seems as though theism is a better explanation than naturalism in this situation. So that is argument one, put off to the side. Argument two is the argument for moral experience. So I'm going to lay out the argument. Humans have moral experience. If humans have moral experience, God exists, therefore God exists. And the conclusion follows logically. So, premise one, humans have moral experience. This is going to be controversial for many reasons, and I can see why it would be. Perhaps I can give a short defense of some kind of moral realism here. And by moral realism, I mean there are facts about what is moral, and these facts are mind independent. In other words, you can be wrong about them. If you think a certain moral fact is true and it's not, you're just wrong, and that's the end of the story. But I think here with moral experience, what I mean by moral experience is the feeling you get when you think of a child dying, or when you think about, no, not necessarily a child dying, someone killing a child. Let's just make this dark, right? The experience you get when you think of someone killing a child is just relatively different from the experience you get from eating the grossest thing imaginable. Now, maybe you might think there's a difference in scale here. Like maybe one's just worse, right? So I think it might be helpful to use a different kind of analogy, something where two things are about on the same level, right? So imagine your friend had a pencil you really wanted to use or something. So you took their pencil and you didn't tell them about it and you stole their pencil. This would kind of have a moral dimension to it. You might experience this as morally wrong, right? Compare this to something like you eat an ice cream, a cup of ice cream with the flavor that you really don't like. Now, there's no moral dimension to eating this ice cream that you don't like, right? It's just kind of gross, maybe. So there does seem to be a distinction here between mere distaste and moral experience. So with premise two, if humans have moral experience, God exists. So I think this is true, and this runs a similar line as my last argument. And my last argument said something like if cognitive faculties are generally reliable, God exists, and because evolution doesn't really select for true beliefs and reliable cognitive faculties. Similarly, here, evolution doesn't seem to select for moral experience, right? I think at the very most, evolution might select for distaste and taste, right? And so all evolution needs to get the adaptive process off the ground is you disliking something, right? So I can imagine us merely disliking stealing or merely disliking lying, and it would give us enough incentive to not do it. Dislike it in the same way that we dislike a certain kind of ice cream or something else you don't like. But it's strange because we don't merely have dislike, we have a moral dimension to our preference. And I don't know what naturalistic explanation might be there to explain this. It doesn't seem as though evolution would ever select for a moral experience. I don't see what reason it might have. Like I don't know what adaptive advantage a moral experience might have. Maybe it does, but I don't necessarily see that. So it seems as though naturalistic mechanisms don't account for moral experience. And if there's no naturalistic explanation, there might be a supernaturalistic explanation, and this looks something maybe like theism. So it seems as though theism is a better explainer than naturalism in this example. And as I said, the conclusion follows logically, therefore God exists. And I didn't say all of my notes here, and I kind of added a few things here and there, but those are my two arguments. So, thank you.
So now rebuttals?
Now rebuttals, yes sir.
All right.
Okay.
All right.
Yep.
In Wade's first argument, he argued that we have generally reliable cognitive faculties, and yet the history of humanity seems to be a testimony to the general unreliability of our cognitive faculties. Consider the following questions that our generally reliable cognitive faculties are unable to answer. Our generally reliable cognitive faculties can't establish what the meaning of life is. Our generally reliable faculties can't establish if free will exists. Our generally reliable faculties can't even establish if God exists. Our generally reliable faculties can't establish which religion is true. I submit that the ignorance that humans have displayed and continue to display is what we would expect if naturalism and evolution are true. True beliefs are not necessary for the continuation of our species. Wade and I agree on that. And that is why human history is a testimony to ignorance and not generally reliable cognitive faculties. In short, my response to Wade's argument is as follows. If God exists, human history would not be a testimony to ignorance. Human history is a testimony to ignorance, therefore God does not exist. With respect to Wade's second argument for moral experience, I want to start by saying that I too am a moral realist, and by that I mean that I believe that there are moral facts that exist independently of all minds. In short, I believe there are objective moral facts. I also believe that moral realism would be true even if God didn't exist, because these truths exist independently of all minds, including a divine mind. Grounding morality in God would make it subjective, because it would mean that moral facts are contingent on at least one perspective, namely a divine perspective. If moral facts are dependent on a perspective, even if it's a divine perspective, and even if this being is perfectly loving and perfectly good, morality would cease to be objective. So if moral realism is true, independently of God's existence, do we need God to explain moral experience? Now, for the sake of Wade's argument, let's suppose that God exists and is the ultimate explanation of moral experience. I believe that one could reasonably assume, if God is the explanation behind moral experience, that it would mean that humans would have generally reliable moral faculties. That is to say, moral faculties that are tracking with the truth. Now ask yourself this one simple question. When you look at human history, does it look like humans have generally reliable moral faculties? If humans have generally reliable moral faculties, why did it take us centuries to acknowledge that slavery is wrong and that women have equal moral status as men? If humans have generally reliable moral faculties, why does profound moral disagreement exist? We disagree on important issues such as abortion, LGBTQ rights, capital punishment, and whether war is ever justified, just to name a few issues. Suppose for a moment that God does not exist, and our faculty for moral experiences, or moral knowledge, came about through unguided processes not aimed at truth, namely evolution and naturalism. If this is the case, I believe that we could reasonably predict that humans would have generally unreliable moral faculties. I submit that humans do have generally unreliable moral faculties, and I believe this is evidence that God does not exist. In short, my response to Wade's moral experience argument is as follows. If our moral cognitive faculties are unreliable, God does not exist. Our moral cognitive faculties are unreliable, therefore, God does not exist. The floor is yours once again.
Okay. Okay. I'm writing down a few notes right quick. Okay. Thank you so much, John. That was a wonderful rebuttal. Okay, so we're gonna be responding to John's God world and the argument from religious ambiguity. These two arguments are very clever, and I appreciate both of them. They are wow, I like them a lot. So I do have a few worries about these this okay, let's start with God world. So I understand perfection to be the same as maximal value. Right? This might be contentious, and I think we can discuss this in the open discussion. But I think you can equivocate this with maximal value. And I think plausibly you can say maximal perfect value. Or no, maximal possible value. My bad. I can't speak. So if that's the case, it seems as though a world with just God is not perfect, right? I don't want to grant this. I think God himself is perfect. I think God is maximally possibly valuable, right? He's as valuable as he could be, right? But that doesn't entail reality is perfect because it's not as valuable as it could be, right? So there are values that God couldn't have by himself. That of relationship, that of overcoming obstacles, you know, getting rid of addictions. It's not as if God really has to get over this addiction that he. No, like I mean, the it seems as though like a world with other creatures that can exemplify these goods would add value to the world, right? And I kind of agree. There might be a background assumption here that if God exists, then reality does have to be perfect. And I agree with that. I just think that reality is not perfect with just God, right? So I do have a heavy burden of proof when it comes to claiming this reality is perfect, right? Because we have problems of evil and divine hiddenness and then, other things. And, that's something I have to account for. But I think that a just God world would not be perfect, even though God himself is perfect. So that's my response to God world. And I'm not exactly responding to a specific premise or anything. I'm just kind of generally giving out thoughts here. So religious ambiguity. So the argument from religious ambiguity, to restate, if God exists, religious ambiguity would not exist. Religious ambiguity does exist. Therefore, God does not exist. So if God exists, religious ambiguity would not exist. So I wonder about this premise, right? Because it seems as though, like, maybe, because we started this conversation off, and maybe I subtly prepared the way for me now at the beginning by saying this at the beginning. Um, Religion may not be the tool God wants to use to impart meaning, right? Because my theism is religious, right? So maybe he doesn't want to use religion. Maybe there's some kind of corruption in religion that God doesn't really want to associate with, right? He might have independent reasons to allow for. That's a different conversation. But religions can be kind of corrupt sometimes, and it's like, why would we want this vehicle to be the vehicle of meaning, right? So that's kind of defeasible. I wouldn't sit on that argument, but that's something to think about. So I wonder how much religious ambiguity there is. I think there is a good bit of ambiguity on questions of meaning um and and purpose and all these things. If there's complete religious ambiguity, if like no one knows anything about meaning or anything, I think this argument does get off the ground. But it does seem as though, like, like there's at least partial knowledge of, meaning and different things. And I think if we have partial knowledge of meaning and different things, then I can see a justification for that. And a justification for that might be something like the pursuit of understanding, the value of disagreement, the goodness of. So I wrote this down. The good of freedom to suppress the truth outweighs the good of immediate knowledge, right? So it's somewhat of like a free will defense here, um, and that might be how I might respond to premise one. Premise two. So premise two is religious ambiguity does exist. I think there might be some, but I think they probably agree a lot more than we think they do. Right? I mean, there's emphasis on following values, your conscience, morality. Like most moral beliefs and religions are kind of similar. I mean, like, unfortunately, like, or fortunately, depending on your world. No, I won't say that. That's not necessarily anyway. I won't say that. But there does seem to be consensus on what moral truths are. There's shared values, about well-being. Like generally, the well-being of people is a good thing, right? Prayer. This is kind of an interesting thing. Like prayer and meditation. This might be like a comparison of Eastern and Western philosophy or religion. But I think they kind of work very similarly, and there's similar like um, parts with respect to meaning and purpose, and I think they operate in a very similar way. And there's actually, I mean, the obvious fact that there's agreement on the mere fact that God exists, right? I mean, it's not as if like there's a bunch of religions all claiming a different kind of thing. It's not. I mean, there's Hinduism, obviously, and then there's different kinds of religions out there, but there seems to be a unity on this view that there's a mind out there that's independent of me and is bigger than me and it matters, right? And there's kind of and Alvin Plantinga, of course, has his properly basic argument for God, right? It's like there might be some reason to think that we kind of have this intuition that God exists, much in the same way we have the intuition that our eyesight works. And if that gets off the ground to some extent, if at least some people, have this intuition that God exists, or maybe half, or like 60% of people, I think that's enough to suggest that maybe there's not as much ambiguity as we think there is. And I think, religion aside, I think humans in general actually agree on meaning a lot more than we think we do in general. I think, so we all kind of agree that, we should pursue goodness and we should avoid evil. The value of overcoming obstacles is a good thing. There's actually I'm interested in this in my own life. The similarities between Christianity and secular values. So maybe kind of like a Jordan Peterson type move here. There's kind of, the famous surrender and take up your cross. This is a very powerful notion of giving your life up to something that matters a lot more than your hedonistic pleasure. And that really matters. And I already discussed the properly basic belief that God exists. So because of these reasons, I'm not sure how much religious ambiguity there is. But even if God existed, I can see him allowing for some religious ambiguity. But if there was complete religious ambiguity or a whole lot of it, then yeah, I can see how that would be good evidence against God's existence. There's not that much religious ambiguity as far as I'm aware. So that would be my response. And yeah, thank you.
So we're doing like open dialogue.
Open dialogue, sir.
How do you want to structure that? Like we ask each other a bunch of questions, or
okay, that's a good idea. Maybe we could each start off with a question. So maybe we can go back and forth between questions.
Sure, yeah.
Okay.
Who do you want to go first?
Since we don't have like a live stream in the future, I want to have a live stream and have like people asking questions.
Boy,
yeah.
You got to realize live streams are evidence against God's existence.
Problem of evil.
especially the problem of gratuitous evil of audience questions. Anyway, but
anyway, all right. So you want to ask? You can ask the question first.
Sure. Is God perfect?
So I guess by our definition, necessarily, right?
If God and only God exists, would not the sum total of reality be God?
Yes. Plausibly?
Okay.
Maybe.
Well,
at this, it might be incoherent to think of. I was thinking about the philosophy of time a little bit when I was thinking about rebutting to what you were saying. So it might be incoherent to think of God as in time, but it might be helpful. So maybe not like a strict. So at time one, reality is perfect with just God. But at time two, even though this language of time doesn't work really, but maybe we can conceptualize it this way. At time two, reality with humans is better, right? And so God would actualize this world rather than that one because it's better, because he wants maximal possible value.
If God is perfect, would he? How do I want to frame this question? If God is perfect, does he lack anything?
He doesn't lack anything. The only thing he would lack would be impossibilities. So, no.
That wouldn't be. I would say that's not a lack if you can't do like a contradiction. And possibly these contradictions aren't things to be done. So unless you want to go with Descartes, and Descartes, argued famously that God could do the logically impossible.
Okay.
I'm not quite sure what a feat like that would look like. I suppose it would be a married bachelor in our midst. But so you would agree that if God is perfect, he lacks nothing.
He lacks nothing. Correct.
Okay, my follow-up question would be, if he's perfect, if he lacks nothing, why does he create? Why create?
I think actually it is interesting to talk about this possibility thing, because there are things that are valuable that he couldn't have without the existence of other creatures, like relationships, right? Maybe you could say relationship with, the Trinity or something. But beings like us, like that's impossible to have with just God. So there's a sense in which he lacks that value, but it's not a problem because he's still maximally perfect. He's as valuable as he could be without us. you know.
Without trying to come across as confrontational, can you see where I might have some tension in thinking and hearing you say God is perfect and lacks nothing, and yet he also seems to be lacking the good of uh, relationship with finite creatures. That seems to be the first statement, that God is perfect and lacks nothing, and then he lacks the good of relationship with finite creatures.
So okay, so I guess maybe another way to word this would be something like, unless he created, he wouldn't be perfect. So it's necessarily part of his nature to have created something, right?
So
So I guess you're right. So I guess like if he doesn't create something, he's lacking something. Therefore, he's not perfect, right? I kind of like this way of thinking. It's a better structuring. I like that better. So without the creation of, he's not perfect. So he had to create. Maybe we can have some kind of divine determinism here, but we don't have to talk about that.
I guess my pushback would be, I don't think you would have a type of theism there, but it wouldn't be perfect being theism, because perfect being theism entails that God is perfect, God lacks nothing, and the theism that you just presented would seem to entail that if God did not create, or God does not create, then he is lacking in some way or is not perfect. Now that would be that isn't evidence for atheism per se, because there could still be a finite God or a almost perfect God, but it would seem to falsify perfect being theism.
So I think implicit in what you're saying is that there's a possibility that God could be separate from creation, that God could have not created. And I'm not saying that, right? I think under this picture of perfect being theism, he had to create, right? Because without the creation, he wouldn't be perfect. That is, I don't see the problem with that. I mean, there might
The,
be problems in other areas, but like
the
not.
well, the problem well, the two problems. One would be if God is perfect. Um, one of the activities ascribed to a perfect being is not activity. One of the, I don't know if to call this a attribute, but classical theologians, classical philosophers argued that for God to be perfect means he has perfect freedom, meaning that he is not determined by anything other than himself. And if what you're saying it's true, it seems as though he's determined to create a creation because he needs something outside of himself to fulfill a need that's lacking.
You could probably word it like that. I don't necessarily say that it's problematic. I mean, you might say something like, um, I wonder how to make a parody argument of that. It would be kind of like saying God really needs his omnipotence or something. It's like, I mean, maybe, but like that doesn't make, that's kind of the wrong dialectic move to make.
So
I mean,
you would say that God necessarily creates because he's good.
so I do agree with you that free will matters, and I think it's an attribute of a perfect being. I think there's many different versions of a perfect world, right? So he could have created one, he could have created the other, but he chose one rather than the other, right? And maybe there's a whole host. I don't know how many possible perfect
Sure.
worlds there are. Like, and again, by perfection we mean maximum possible value. And I can conceive of like if they bring a bunch of different worlds with the same amount of value, and if they're all maximal, and they're exemplified in different ways.
I'll leave one closing thought, and I'll let you have the last word
This is so much
on
fun.
this
I love this. Is so much
segment.
fun.
But I just want the audience to think about what's entailed by what Wade has said. If what Wade has said is correct, then God needs us to fulfill a need that he has. But that's not all that's entailed. Think about what the nature of creation is. God created a world that was going to be filled with earthquakes, tsunamis, horrendous suffering, divine hiddenness, and we could go on. So not only does this being need us in order to fulfill a need, but what does he create? He creates the world that we live in now, a world full of horrendous suffering, horrendous natural evils, horrendous moral evils. And I submit that if the creation as it exists right now, if that is what's needed to satisfy the needs of a God who is lacking, I suppose we could say that such a being actually isn't good. Because if the creation that we have, that is filled with horrendous evil and horrendous suffering, is what's needed to satisfy the needs of a God who lacks. I don't think such a being is worthy of worship, and I don't think such a being is worthy of the title of God. And if that is the case, perhaps what's most rational to conclude is that such a being does not exist. And so the floor is yours to any concluding thoughts on this.
Yeah, I might let you have the last word on that. I mean, I do kind of want to like go through different like points that we've probably written down in response to each other,
Sure.
and once we kind of do that, maybe we can revisit some of these other questions.
Absolutely. Sure.
And so we can kind of cover all bases. I know people watching are just like, oh, what does Wade have to say? Oh my goodness. I mean, personally, I don't have much to say because like that was a good response. But I mean, I do have something to say. But you know, we can kind of shelf that, you know, for later.
Can I ask you some questions about religious ambiguity?
Please, please.
All right. Okay.
This was fun. Okay, so I should say what was premise one with religious ambiguity?
Let me go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if God exists, religious ambiguity would not exist. Like I really tried to find a way to debunk this. Could not. Like this is a really good premise.
Well, that's because the argument works. No,
like this is because John.
kidding.
I mean, okay. Anyway, questions.
All right. Well, I asked you this question earlier, but you know, for the sake of the audience, so I'll ask you again. Do you believe God is perfect?
Yes.
Would a perfect being leave it? Well, we'll take a few steps back. Would you say that if God exists, a good analogy to describe God's relationship with humans would be like a parent-child analogy?
Plausibly. Maybe.
It doesn't have to be a complete 1-to-1 ratio, because obviously there's going to be ways in which God is not like your mom or not like your dad. But you know,
I do. Yeah, I don't know. I don't want to get too pedantic on that. Maybe, but I might change my mind on that when we start talking. So
the reason why I think such analogy is helpful is God is classically conceived as all loving, and one of the ways in which we talk about love is to think about parent-child analogies, but we can save that for later.
I
My
mean,
question,
you can use it if you want. Like
for sure, if God is a loving parent or a maximally perfect parent, you know, I'll do an analogy and then I'll get to my question. Now, imagine if a mom was raising her two sons, and she tells one son, or gives one son a certain set of instructions. Goes, you know, if you clean the living room, we'll get pizza tonight. And then the mom tells the other son, if you make the living room messy, we'll get pizza tonight. It's really odd to think about that. Let's think about that for a moment. She's given one son a certain set of instructions. You clean up the living room, we'll go get pizza tonight. And she's given the other son a contradictory set of instructions. Mess up the living room, and then we'll get pizza tonight. And let's also say that the boys are maybe 6 or 7 years old. They're really young. One's 6, one's 8. One boy's been told, clean up the living room, we'll get pizza. The other boy's been told, mess up the living room, we'll go get pizza. The two boys go to the living room, and one has a broom, and one has mud on his hands. And one wants to clean, and the other one wants to mess up the living room. And it creates tension. The two of the boys, as little kids will do, start arguing. Fisticuffs start coming out. They start hitting and slapping each other. And the whole living room's a mess. And then mom comes back in and yells at both of the boys and makes them feel bad, even though it's her fault that they had the fight. She gave them a contradictory set of instructions, and they both tried to follow the instructions to the best of their ability, but they were contradictory instructions. And that's what led to the result of the two of them fighting and messing up the living room further.
Yeah.
Now, we would all look at a case like that and go, that mom is not loving. Really, something really, really wrong there. Like, would an all loving, or would a mom who's loving give contradictory instructions to her kid, and then not only that, punish them for trying to follow the contradictory instructions to the best of their ability? And I submit, as silly as that illustration is, I think it's an illustration for the problem of religious ambiguity. We have countless religions who have Wade is correct that, we have things like the golden rule, do unto others as they'll do unto you. There are points of commonality, but I believe among religions, but I believe points of commonality can also be explained if naturalism and evolution are true. But setting that aside, my question would be, let me say one more thing, then I'll get to the question. If God exists, if he's a perfectly loving parent, I don't believe religious ambiguity would exist. The instructions that different religions have for how a person is saved, for what the moral life should look like, what meaning in life should look like,
Yeah.
even how God created it all, just like the illustration with the mom and the two boys, it appears that there's contradictory sets of instructions.
Yep.
And as a result of the contradictory instructions, the two boys fought in my analogy. But as a result of the contradictory instructions, what do we see in world history? We see crusades. We see 9/11. We see we see biblical genocide. We see whole hosts of religious-induced violence. But not only that, if any of these one religions is true, just as the mother punished the boys for giving them contradictory instructions, if any of these one religions is true, then that means that God is going to punish all of his other children who attempted to follow their contradictory instructions to the best of their ability. And to me, that just seems grossly unjust. And with all of this background knowledge, my question, I only have one question about religious ambiguity, then we get to your questions. Would a perfect being leave us in the dark about origin, morality, meaning, and destiny?
So here's the thing. This is exactly what I was toying with. The answer is no. I think God would absolutely impart at least, I don't want to put a number on it, pull it out of thin air, but like 75%.
It would lead to a vagueness problem anyway, so
Yeah, that's fine. But yeah, no, I can pretty much grant this. I think if God exists, he would at least give a good bit of knowledge of how to. So this is what's interesting, right? So I don't know where the parent-child argument might break down, but it doesn't break down here, so we can go with it. So I don't know, it's analogous, right? So I think with the mother would be analogous to people who started religions. And I think the father, watching the situation, would be God. And if he allowed it to happen, that would be the situation we're in. Now, maybe that father has sufficient reasons to allow the situation to happen. And we can give sufficient reasons, right? There's the good freedom, right?
Can I give some pushback to that?
Yep.
My pushback. The reason why I don't think the father or God is the father in this case, it's because let's imagine for a moment that God is the mother and God is giving Islam, instructions about Islam. He's giving Jews instructions about Judaism. He's giving Christians instructions about Christianity. And the instructions are radically different.
Yeah.
They might have some similarity, at least in the mom and the son's similarity. What is the similarity? They're both supposed to go to the living room, so there is some common ground there. But the instructions are radically different. So that was the point of the analogy, was to say that.
And
yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, I would just say he's not giving instructions to those. So my first point, I think maybe it matters a whole lot more than I thought it did. Religion isn't how God wants to impart knowledge of meaning. Maybe God isn't starting these religions. Maybe he's not, starting this whole Christian thing and then this Islam thing, this Judaism thing. Like, this is a human invention, plausibly, under this view, right? And maybe God looks at it, it's like, oh, they're really missing the point. Like, this is horrible. And I think actually what happens is, when you get to maybe some religious beliefs that are counterintuitive morally, there actually is a situation of a trade-off, right? Because the person who is committed to this religious doctrine or whatever, there's a sense in which like they really have to suppress their moral intuition, right, in order to accept this doctrine. So I think maybe religions are actually doing some work to suppress some moral intuitions, even though they actually happen to use some of the tools God did give them, such as meaningful life, such as morality, such as the golden rule, such as all these things.
So let's imagine for a moment that you're right, that God hasn't used religions as a vehicle for communicating to
Or partially, like not totally, but
all right,
maybe.
let's say that religion hasn't been the total the complete way that he's communicated to humanity. Let's say that he's communicated bits and pieces of himself, herself, whatever the divine is, to creatures. My question for you is, even based on what you said, even if religion isn't the primary means by which God communicates to humanity, I think there still would be revelation of some sort if a perfect being exists, even if all organized religions are false. Wouldn't you agree that a perfect being would try to communicate, leave us with some form of unambiguous communication?
Yes. So I also would probably grant this, and I think the form of unambiguous communication would be something like an intuition. Right now, this intuition can't account for everything. We don't just have moral and aesthetic intuitions. Plausibly, we have intuitions about what matters, right? And I don't think you have to have many resources to know what matters. Turns out that a lot of the most impoverished communities find more meaning than people who have billions of dollars and they're Elon Musk and they have Teslas, right? I mean, the resources of meaning are accessible, it's seemingly, to anyone. Like,
So,
what one more thing? I mean, there's stories of people in the Holocaust who find incredible meaning in their situation, right? And it's not there were zero external resources for them to access. It's not as if there was like, you know, some journal, How to Live a Meaningful Life for the Jew, on a Nazi desk. No, like they just kind of use their experience in some meaningful way to actually derive meaning. So it's actually kind of built into the human condition to, no matter what happens, derive meaning, and that's kind of, that might be, evidence that we do have resources. Yeah.
I would just this is the last thing I'll say. I would just ask the audience to watch my portion of my rebuttal to Wade's arguments from the reliability of our cognitive faculties and the reliability of our moral cognitive faculties, because I think what I said there provides reasonable rebuttals for Wade's response here. But Wade, do you have
And
any questions?
that's actually a perfect segue. That's actually perfect because we can
Sure.
continue talking about this in the context of my arguments. Yeah. Okay. Um. Yeah. So your first point was something about the general unreliability of cognitive faculties. So when I'm talking about the reliability of cognitive
It's
faculties,
mouthful.
a mouthful. I'm not talking about things like the meaning of life. I'm not talking about things like free will or whether or not God exists. Now that actually might be something that the theist might consider. When I use the word cognitive faculty, I'm talking about your eyesight, your smell, your hearing. Maybe this cognitive faculty that tells you that reason works. Maybe the cognitive faculty that tells you that murder is wrong. Right? This is very different than this kind of feeling slash intuition slash maybe evidentially based intuition that certain claims about reality are true or false, right? So it's not as if the scientific community intuits that evolution is the best theory of life. It's like we kind of do the research, we do the thinking, and all of this stuff. It's very different than an intuition strictly when it comes to eyesight or different kinds of senses. So as far as I can tell, I mean, maybe it's a problem for theism that God isn't imparting knowledge on the meaning of life, on free will, whether God exists or religions are true. But I think we just discussed this, where, I mean, the religion's truth may not matter to God. Whether or not God exists may not matter to God, right? Maybe God just cares about people living a good life. Maybe he doesn't care about them knowing that he exists. Maybe he would, but I can see reason maybe why he wouldn't. Maybe he would just add unnecessary complexity to people's otherwise meaningful life, right? With free will, as long as we believe that it works, right? And most people believe that it works. So there's not much of a problem here. That's contentious. The meaning of life, we've just discussed that maybe there was not as much disagreement as we thought there was. So that might be a response to your rebuttal, and maybe you can respond to that.
Yeah, no, I would just say, if perfect being theism's true and God designed our cognitive faculties, I I guess it might just be my intuition. I think The fact that we can't know what the meaning of life is. You said that we had more agreement. I would give pushback. I don't. I actually think there's a lot more disagreement on what meaning entails than maybe you would. For instance, a Christian might say meaning is found in loving your enemies. Certain strands of Islam would strongly disagree with that, and if you were to ask a Viking what the meaning of life was thousands of years ago, and you told them, well, loving your enemies plays a part in that, I think they would strongly disagree with that. But
Yeah.
set aside disagreements on the meaning of life, I think if God does exist and designed our cognitive faculties, I think it is surprising that we can't establish what meaning is. I think it is surprising that we can't establish with reasonable certainty that free will exists. I think it is surprising that we can't establish maybe not what religion's true, but maybe what the truest facts are about God. So we can leave religion out of the equation. If God designed our cognitive faculties, I think it is surprising that so many people have disagreement on what God looks like. And I just want to say, and I'll keep giving pushback on this, I think the amount of ignorance that we see in the history of humanity is indeed shocking. If a perfect being designed our cognitive faculties to obtain truth,
Yeah.
can you see where my
Yeah.
intuition is coming from on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So you said here, if I think your argument was something like, if history is testimony to ignorance, therefore atheism is true. History is a testimony to ignorance, therefore atheism is true.
So,
What's up?
no, it's fine. Yeah, you're good.
Yeah, so that was kind of the next point that I was going to kind of look at. Um, I wonder if we can shelf that for a second still. Because let's say theism doesn't provide obvious answers for these things like disagreement with respect to the meaning of life, free will, God existence. Maybe there's theodicies for that, maybe they don't work. Maybe we can pull a not really skeptical theism, but kind of skeptical theism here. The point is, I don't mean to shift the burden of proof here, but like, what other explanation would you have for the reliability of cognitive faculties? It's like naturalism surely couldn't explain
Oh,
this.
I don't think they are reliable, and that's what I argued in my rebuttal. I think
Okay.
we can get truth, but I think that our ability to grasp truth is very, very, very limited.
Well,
And if let me just finish my thought. If
okay.
evolution selects selects beliefs that are advantageous for survival, I think we would expect to see a history of ignorance. And what do we have? We have a history of ignorance. And I think that evolution and naturalism combined give a simpler explanation for why history has been filled with so much ignorance than an explanation that says, well, actually, God designed our cognitive faculties to obtain truth. Like to me,
And
that
yes,
seems ad hoc. I think that evolution and naturalism provide a simpler explanation for why reality is so confusing.
yeah. No, okay, this is so interesting because we're actually getting like really excited about the opposite view. This is so much fun. No, okay, so when I'm talking about cognitive faculties, though, like you have to understand, we're not talking about beliefs about free will or the meaning of life. We're not talking about. I mean, I understand that's a separate problem for theism, but we can kind of shelf that for a second. Like what I'm talking about is the belief that what we're seeing is really out there. I can literally imagine a world where maybe evolution programs us to see random stuff. Like maybe evolution select for some whatever reason, maybe like we actually just see like apples and oranges like floating in space or something. Like there's not actually oranges and apples, and I can imagine the evolutionary process still makes it such that our bodies adapt to their environments and the reproduction of our species continues, right? So it just seems it's like why aren't we seeing apples and
I
oranges?
I guess I just don't share that intuition. The reason why is I'm not trying to sound harsh. I think it's just trivially true that um, true beliefs have more adaptive value than false beliefs. And let me give you an illustration of this. It's not original with me. I heard it in a debate with Eric Hernandez and Justin Schieber. Imagine for a moment, we'll call him Chris. Chris has this false belief that he's Superman, and Chris wants to keep his identity a secret. And he sees that. Imagine he sees a cat is trapped in a tree, and he doesn't want to fly up in the tree. He thinks he's Superman, and he doesn't want to fly. Just for the audience knows, he's not actually Superman. He can't fly. He doesn't have any at all. Just in case they missed the point of the illustration. But he has this false belief that he's Superman, but he also believes that he also wants to rescue the cat. He doesn't want the cat to stay stuck in the tree. So instead of flying, he climbs the tree and he rescues the cat out of the tree, and he saves the cat's life. But he has all these false beliefs, and he still saves the cat's life. Schieber points out that a belief like that, a false belief like that, would not have evolutionary advantages. Because if you had that kind of delusion, imagine trying to date. If you have delusions like you think you're Superman. And Schieber's point was, if he had true beliefs about himself, it probably would have more evolutionary advantage than if he had this false belief that he was Superman. So I just want to say again, and again, you can challenge this. To me, it just seems intuitively obvious that true beliefs have more advantage than false beliefs.
I think plausibly I can grant this, but I think there's a meta level here where it's like, why does evolution select for beliefs at all, right? So like, I mean, clearly false beliefs have no advantage. I mean, I think I would agree with this too. False beliefs don't have any evolutionary like advantage. Like there's no, again, as you said, like what would the false? I agree with this, but like then there's still a question though. Like, why would we have true beliefs as well? It's like it doesn't seem like evolution could. Why would it give rise to true beliefs? Maybe why would it give rise to beliefs at all? Like there's still kind of this question. I guess.
I think my pushback would be it's just a brute fact that we are able to obtain true beliefs. And again, both of us have to have an appeal to something that's brute fact. You would say the brute fact would be God is rational, and He designed us to be rational. That would be the brute fact for you. For me, it would just be we're able to have true beliefs because we're able. I would say that reason itself exists independently of our minds. That there is reason or rationality at all is a necessary truth. And it's just something that humans have access to. And just as I can't give a philosophical account for why I believe other minds exist or why I believe the external world exists, I'm justified in believing in the external world. I'm justified in believing in other minds. And even if I can't give a full account for why I believe that humans are able to exercise reason and that reason exists, I don't think that leaves me in a state of being unjustified in believing that humans are able to obtain truth.
No, so I wouldn't say that. I mean, my first premise is like cognitive faculties are reliable. So I mean, I don't have to say that you're not justified. Like you're still justified. There's a question like, why are you justified? Like, I mean, how do you have
my answer to why we have any true beliefs at all is that reason is reasonable, and we're able to have true beliefs. Full stop. That's it. That I know. I can understand why that explanation would not be satisfactory to you. My only pushback would be, think about the inverse. If the inverse is true, if God did design our cognitive faculties to obtain truth, ignorance, or the amount of ignorance that we have and the reality that history is a testimony of human ignorance seems to me to be a much larger bullet to bite than just saying our ability to have true beliefs is just a brute fact.
So maybe I should really emphasize the need for an explanation here. Like, I mean, so I gave the example of a plant. Like, I don't see why. I mean, you can actually extend this conversation to consciousness in general, right? That might be a different kind of argument to make. But it doesn't seem to me that there's any need for any kind of conscious experience. One, we can shelf that. But, like, for specifically beliefs, and then more specifically, beliefs that are true. And that seems to be a valuable thing.
And I'll give perhaps maybe not an atheist theodicy, but maybe an atheist defense. I'll be a little more modest. I'll be like Alvin Plantinga's free will defense. And I don't want to make any pronouncements about metaphysics or ontology, but let's suppose for a moment that Platonism's true, that there are Platonic objects out there And let's suppose that reason and truth are just platonic objects that exist necessarily, even if God doesn't exist. And some way, somehow, humans have come into existence. Now, if we were to talk about a contingency argument, I would just say that humans exist. It is contingent, but I believe we have no explanation for why humans exist. Full stop. I would just say that humans exist is a reality, and I don't think we need to give any further explanation. I don't even know if a further explanation is possible, but we could shelve that. If we were to talk about the contingency argument, that would be a whole other conversation. But let's get back to the Platonism. Let's suppose that reason exists necessarily, truth exists necessarily, and humans, some way, somehow, have come into existence. If these necessary truths exist, some way, somehow, humans have access to them. Now, your pushback is going to be, how do we have access to them? And I would simply say there is no explanation other than the fact that that reason exists necessarily, truth exists necessarily, and some way, somehow, in the evolutionary process, we've been able to obtain some true beliefs. But because evolution doesn't select for true beliefs, I believe we have the history of ignorance that we have.
Yeah, I mean, I probably don't want to say something like, yeah, we have some true beliefs. I mean, it's not just true beliefs here. We're talking about the reliability of our cognitive faculties. In other words, every time I look at something, I have a justified true belief that it will give me accurate information about reality. Like, I'm not worried that I might look at the door and be like, oh man, is there actually a door there? I'm not worried, and I never should be. The fact that we have such consistency across time is wild on naturalism. Like, that's just like boom. And if we have some kind of theodicy about this meaning of life stuff, the free will, the testimony to ignorance, all of that's fine, right? But even if we kind of don't, like, even if we can pull a skeptical theism here, where it's like, I mean, I don't necessarily know, but at the very least, theism's a better explanation than naturalism. Like, I mean, we have all
I,
this
I
unexplained stuff. Oh,
would
listen,
grant you,
so we have this unexplained stuff on theism, right, which is the meaning of life and free will stuff. But the unexplained stuff on naturalism is just like worse. Like, that seems to me like really needs to cry out for an explanation. But yeah,
and I'm willing to grant that perhaps it cries out for an explanation. My only point is perhaps there isn't one beyond the explanation that I gave. And perhaps we're just going to be at a place where whatever the foundation of reality is, there's going to be a sense in which it's not going to make sense, where there are going to have answers that are above our kin. And that's why you would appeal to things like skeptical theism and theodicies, because you would grant that even theism has issues that you just say, well, I don't know. I don't have a full satisfactory explanation. So we're both in agreement that there are going to be places in our worldview where we're not going to have a totally satisfying explanation for a particular issue. And in my case, it would be why we're able to have true beliefs at all. In your case, it would be why is there so much ignorance in
yeah.
human history?
And I guess
And,
the question, which one's worse? You
and
know?
to me, that perhaps our ability to grasp truth is an accident of history. Perhaps it's a happy accident of history. But if our true beliefs came about through accident in an unguided way, to me, that seems to make more explain the or the fact of human ignorance more
So
than the explanation that our cognitive faculties were designed.
here's a different move I can make here, right? So as far as I can tell, I have presented a few theodicies for the testimony to ignorance. Um, what theodicies might you have for naturalism explaining the reliability of cognitive faculties?
I don't know if I have a theodicy other than I think I would simply say that if evolution is true, our minds weren't designed to obtain truth, and that's it.
Yeah,
And
it kind of seems as though like maybe my theory of theism is at least making strides to cover up these patches, but like I don't know if the naturalist theory even has the resources to even try to explain. Like, you know what I mean?
I suppose if we just take it as a brute fact that humans are able to have true beliefs, I see that as a simpler explanation than a saying that there is a God who designed us to have cognitive faculties to obtain truth, that's created a world with all the ignorance that it contains. To me, appealing to the bruteness of, well, humans just are able to have true beliefs, full stop, end of discussion, seems to be simpler than, well, actually, you want to know why we have so much ignorance? Well, actually, there's a God who designed us to have cognitive faculties that are meant to obtain truth. To me, that seems to be a harder bullet to bite than just saying it's a fact that we're able to have true beliefs.
So this appeal to simplicity is interesting. I don't I don't know how simple that theory is, because like there is a real sense in which beliefs and maybe consciousness, if we go down that road, are simply popping into existence all the time with consistent reliability. Now maybe there's a simplicity in the consistency of it, but like there is a real complexity and complication here where it's like the foundation of all of our philosophical discourse is ungrounded. Like it's just
It wouldn't be ungrounded because, as I said,
not that we're unjustified in our beliefs.
well, no, it wouldn't be ungrounded because an atheist could appeal, and again, I'm not saying Platonism's true, but an atheist could appeal to Platonism and say that the laws of logic exist necessarily, truth exists necessarily, and reason exists necessarily. Now, there might be an epistemic problem. I'm sure you'd want to give pushback to how do we have access to this
That's
realm?
what I meant by ungrounded. That's what I meant
Sure.
by.
I would just say we have access to this realm because we have access to this realm, and I'm not sure if any further explanation is possible. My contention is that your attempt to ground our access to, or your attempt to explain why we have cognitive faculties that are able to obtain truth, doesn't do the heavy lifting that I think you think it does. Because again, it has to account for all of the ignorance that exists in human history. And
Yeah.
perhaps our intuitions are just going to vary on what's a simpler explanation. That humans are able to have true beliefs, full stop, as a brute fact, or God designed our cognitive faculties to obtain truth. Perhaps we just have differing intuitions on which is a harder pill.
See, my thing is like, I mean, what I'm trying to do here is, I think I do have successful, at least quasi, somewhat successful theodicies to some of these questions about testing ignorance. But I'm trying to make a move here where it's like, even if they didn't get off the ground, which theory would work better? And it seems to me that like, I guess it's just kind of a conflict of intuition. Like, I mean, I don't know, like the cost of not knowing the meaning of life and stuff on theism and the free will stuff. It's like, yeah, that's pretty curious. But like, I don't know. It just does strike me as a lot more complicated and a lot more like this is not even just like the debate in this like reverse devil advocate situation that we're doing. Like actually, wait, like in real life, like it does seem simpler, like to posit like that a God explains this than naturalism does. Like I mean, me, But anyway, yeah,
And as I said, I suppose our intuitions are just clashing here because once again,
yeah,
if you were to ask a theist, well, why does God exist? Well, they would say he's self-existent. Well, why is he self-existent? Well, and again, at some point in every worldview, and lest the audience miss this point, there are going to be places in your worldview where you just have to appeal to a brute fact. A theist will say it's a brute fact that God is self-existent because it's a brute fact that something has to exist necessarily. And I would just say in the context of how we obtain true beliefs, it is just a brute fact that humans are able to obtain true beliefs. And if theists are rational for believing that God is self-existent and they can't give an explanation beyond that, I believe that it is rational for me to be able to appeal to the brute factness of humans being able to have true beliefs. And again, I just think we're going to have differing intuitions on.
yeah. Maybe I can like add something interesting here. There is kind of a hope in philosophy and especially science, but also in philosophy, where maybe we can come up with a theory where everything's explained in a sufficient way, in a satisfactory way. And I don't know if I'm not saying you're doing this necessarily. I think your point minimally is something like, yeah, most theories are probably just going to have these brute things, and you got to like which one has the least amount of bruteness and the most amount of explanation and all of that, and like that's fine. But I think maybe we can agree that if there was a theory out there that could just fully explain everything, and there were like no questions left to ask, like of course we would adopt that theory, assuming like it had some level of simplicity and it was better than other ones.
And
And
I
I
think if theism were true, we would all know what that theory is, and there wouldn't be any ambiguity or ignorance in the world.
You're crazy.
And
Well,
yet
so
the world is filled with ambiguity and ignorance. So
yeah. Well, so but here's kind of the point I'm trying to make, right? So like, I mean, the naturalism you're presenting is willing to immediately appeal to bruteness, right? And that's like fine, and that's kind of like actually a little bit pragmatic and a little bit reasonable and understandable, because it's like, yeah, theories are going to have bruteness, but maybe my theory has a little bit of like hope in it, where where it's like, at least I'm having theodicies that are making progress. Like maybe they're climbing this mountain of ultimate explanation, and it seems as though it's making more progress than yours. Maybe there's a simplicity cost, but I actually don't even see the simplicity cost. But even if there is, like, we're actually maybe making more progress in terms of explanation than your theory is, because you've resigned yourself to bruteness, which is commendable because of the practicability of it. But also, like, maybe there's some idealistic thinking that we can have as philosophers here. And you know what I'm saying?
I'll give one last thought on this, and then maybe we could shift to another topic.
Yeah.
Just to sum up everything, Wade is saying that if God designed our cognitive faculties to obtain truth, that reality plus the reality of ignorance, perhaps we can give some kind of theodicy for why I'll just call it gratuitous ignorance exists. Perhaps we can give perhaps Wade can give a theodicy for why gratuitous ignorance exists, and perhaps his theory is able to still make further progress as to what the nature of reality is. And what I'm saying is, perhaps there is no answer for why humans have true beliefs. And may I add one more point, I think, in favor of my view. The fact that we have to have this conversation at all about why humans are able to have true beliefs seems to be a testimony to what? Ignorance. And I'm just going to close by saying that the level of ignorance that we have seems shocking if a perfect God exists who designed our cognitive faculties to obtain truth. And where do you want to go next? Do you want to do religious ambiguity, or do you want to just say something in favor of your arguments, something, or like how you'd answer your arguments, or what do you want to do now?
Well, so I think maybe we don't have to completely cap this conversation. We can cap the cognitive faculty one, but I think it's an easy segue into the second argument that I had. We don't have to
Oh,
spend too
yeah. Moral experience. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so I think honestly it runs a similar line of reasoning. I think all of our arguments are going to apply in the same way at the same time. I think there's going to be an interesting conversation to have about specifically moral cognitive faculties here and the disagreement involved. So here's a kind of picture of reality that actually has a complexity to it that I don't like, but I have hopes that maybe, and again, this is actually Wade speaking, and I think maybe like actually John can sympathize with this. Like, there's kind of a hope that maybe psychology can kind of give us good reason to think that humanity in general does have reliable moral cognitive faculties. Now, like there's a question about like what is a moral faculty? Like what is a moral belief? What's a moral experience? Because it's actually kind of hard to tell. It's kind of hard to tell sometimes. People think they have moral beliefs, but then they discover arguments against them, and it's this whole complicated thing. And there's a whole conversation about what's the difference between intuition that something is morally true and a taste in something. And that's a good conversation to have. So I think here maybe I can make my claim more modest. I was going to say something like, well, there was not disagreement, right? We're just wrong about what our intuitions say, right? Because it's kind of complicated to pin down what our intuitions are, and we're humans and we overthink stuff. But we don't have to be that extreme with the claim. Maybe we could be more modest generally, and maybe like 75% of the time, maybe 60% of the time, maybe they're less reliable than my eyesight. Maybe there's a kind of brokenness to it. And under a certain religion like Christianity, that might be explained pretty well. But I'm not arguing for Christianity, and that might create conflicts in different areas. But I think if we had like maybe 60% reliability, that still cries out for explanation. And even if I wrote this down, even if we had no reliability, there's still this thing that's moral experience. Maybe it's completely like mistargeted, but it doesn't seem as though like naturalism has some kind of mechanism to explain moral experience at all. Like even if it didn't track with any amount of reality. So yeah.
I suppose, and I perhaps should have even appealed to this in my in the conversation about the reliability of our cognitive faculties. Suppose a friend of mine was talking to me recently. Suppose that there's just a sort of natural teleology, or just a naturalistic teleology that
Okay.
just exists. Full stop. It's just a brute given that there is a teleology. There is a way. There is an end for how a human mind is supposed to function. There's an end in which morality is supposed to function, and perhaps that teleology exists, and it's just a brute given. So perhaps when it comes to moral cognitive faculties or moral experience, perhaps there's just some natural teleology that can give an account for why we have moral experiences or moral knowledge. I don't even think we need to appeal to that. It could be true, but I just think that we know moral facts through our intuition. And just as I don't think we can give a non-circular argument for the reliability of our intuitions or the reliability of our sense perception.
I agree.
And I don't believe that that's a problem for the naturalist. It's just as much of a problem for the theist. So I believe that we know moral truths through intuition or through our experiences, like you said. And I think that's just true, full stop.
Yeah, so I like this. I agree with most of the last part of what you said. Yeah, so I'm not saying you're unjustified in your beliefs,
But
right? I mean,
sure. Thank you. That's very kind. But
sure.
but my question would be, what explanatory power does adding God into the equation bring?
It brings in the question. Well, it answers the question of why do we have access to them, right? I can.
We have access to them through intuition.
Yeah.
Same.
Like, why do we have the intuition?
We have the intuition because we have the intuition.
Yeah, like, I mean, come on, man. Like, so okay, maybe minimal.
To me, asking the question, why do we have the intuition, is analogous to asking why intuitions are reliable in the first place.
No, it would be more analogous to asking why do you have reliable eyesight? And you can answer that question in terms of biology, and that would be a good move to make because biology wants to answer that question for good reasons, right?
But I think you can see where I'm coming from, though, is I can't give an explanation for why I have intuitions at all, or why intuitions are reliable at all. But I can say, like I said, I made an appeal to like a natural teleology. Perhaps there is a natural teleology. I'm not committed to that, but perhaps that's the reason why human minds seem like they have the ability, or why moral experience seems to be reliable. But I want to take the pressure off of myself for a moment.
No,
Put you on the hot seat with in regards to moral disagreement. If God designed our moral cognitive faculties to be able to obtain truth, if our moral experiences are meant to be testimonies to the truth, why do we have so much moral disagreement? Does that seem to be surprising to you at all if theism's true?
Yeah, so maybe I can go back to something I said a minute ago and like revise it and work it in your favor. So I said something along the lines of even if our moral faculties were completely unreliable, there's still a question of why do we have them? Yeah, so if they're completely unreliable or like mostly unreliable, then like I think both naturalism and theism would be bad explainers. So I don't know if one would win out over the other. So I think I do want to grant that. Um, I think I don't want to pull a number out of the air, but I think as long as we have maybe 60, 75% plus reliable, cognitive faculties, then yeah. And again, I really do want to bring out the distinction between an intuition and merely a taste or a belief developed through other means. I think it's perfectly possible. Now, I don't think the person is necessarily morally responsible for this. I don't think they're morally responsible at all for this. I think this is completely reasonable. I think doing philosophy, what happens is you actually end up suppressing moral intuitions a lot because there's a lot of views that people hold that they know are morally unintuitive, but because of a certain kind of commitment they have to ethical theories, they reject the intuition. So one kind of example is utilitarianism. The trolley example, would you push the fat guy over to save 5 people? The modern day utilitarian might say something like, yeah, I would push the fat guy over because it's part of my theory. But then you would say, well, that's unintuitive, so you should revise your theory. And then the utilitarian would be like, no, that's the point of the theory, right? We have a theory so we can, put a structure around our moral claims. And I don't know. I think the person who's not the utilitarian, talking utilitarian, has the advantage. I think the move to revise the theory is a good idea. I don't think you start with the theory and then unintuitive thing or intuitive things just get thrown out because it's not part of your theory. I don't even remember the exact point I was trying to make with that. I just think that like plausibly we could have some justified belief that our actual intuitions aren't in that much disagreement. And that can be seen through, I guess, just general beliefs that the golden rule, that we should treat others with kindness. Even the worst people on the planet actually kind of have the aim of goodness, right? I mean, like I was listening to podcasts the other day. I'll let you speak in a second, but like I was listening to a podcast, and the guy was talking about a difference between Hitler and some other guy, and how the other guy was worse because the other guy liked killing for the sake of killing. But Hitler thought that the annihilation of the Jews was a public service to Germany, right? So at least, Hitler's a horrible person, but at least, he had some knowledge of goodness. Maybe he was wrong about how to get there, and he was wrong about what goodness was, maybe, and that might matter. But at least he was aimed at goodness in some sense, and that's what I would say.
I would say that everything that you've just said is actually evidence for the fact that moral knowledge, moral experience is just a brute truth. And it's a brute truth. If you combine that with evolution and naturalism, I think that has better explanatory power and simpler explanatory power for moral disagreement than everything you just said. If we accept that moral knowledge or moral experience are just brute givens, and then we ask ourselves, well, why is there moral disagreement? All I have to say is, yeah, evolution plus naturalism would predict that moral disagreement would exist because our moral knowledge, our moral experience, it's our evolution's not meant to guide us to true beliefs about morality. So of course we're going to have moral disagreement.
Well, so I don't know if evolution would predict that or naturalism would predict it because I don't know what about naturalism would predict the existence of moral experience at all, reliable or unreliable. Why would naturalism predict that at all?
I,
Unless it's a fruit, unless it's a
I'm saying
thing.
conjunction of naturalism and evolution. If those things are
Yeah.
true,
Okay. Yeah.
if there isn't a mind behind reality, so that's all I mean by naturalism.
Yes.
If there
Even
is
then.
no if there is no mind guiding anything. No, remember what I said though. True, I said that the fact that we have moral experience or moral knowledge is just a brute given. If there's no explanation beyond that, and you take that in conjunction with naturalism and evolution, I
Yeah.
believe we reasonably predict that moral disagreement exists. And
Okay.
tremendous moral or gratuitous moral disagreement would exist.
Yes.
And I believe that is a simpler explanation than positing, hold up, no, there is actually a God who designed us with moral faculties that are aimed at truth. To me, that seems very ad hoc in accounting for why there's a gratuitous moral disagreement that exists. And that seems more ad hoc than me being unable to give an explanation beyond an appeal to bruteness for why we have moral knowledge or moral experiences at all.
Yeah. So I guess for the audience listening, like I think what matters here is how ad hoc the theory is, because we can, I kind of like the move where we can grant some ad hocness on my theory, right? I think maybe we have responses to these, but let's grant some ad hocness where, like there's this weird moral disagreement out there. So which one's weirder, moral disagreement or unexplained reliability of cognitive faculties, especially with moral experience? And it's not obvious. I mean, like I think to each one of us in this conversation, it might be obvious, but
Well,
it's not obvious in any objective sense.
well, let's throw this into the mix. Your foundation, you have perfection as a part of your foundation. You're
Yeah.
arguing that the foundation of reality from a theist perspective is perfection. I'm arguing that mindlessness is the foundation of my reality.
Yeah.
And I think mindlessness, you can make a prediction for disagreement from mindlessness that's far simpler than a theory that posits perfections at the heart of reality. I think disagreement, gratuitous moral disagreement, seems to me very difficult to predict from a foundation of perfection that, on your view, designed us to have moral knowledge and reliable moral experiences. To me, I don't know. It just
Yeah.
it seems that one is more ad hoc than the other.
And I really do kind of like going back to this point where at least I'm making strides to answer it, right? I mean, with your theory, it seems very implausible that there would be reliable cognitive faculties, especially ones with more like moral experience. That seems really like that. And as you said it's brute, but like that's an ad hoc cause. Like that is you would presumably grant that, but it would just like outweigh the simplicity of your theory, which outweigh mine. But at least I have resources.
Well,
Yeah.
you say your theory makes strides. That presupposes that strides are even possible to be made on these topics.
Yeah.
Perhaps it's just a brute given that we have true beliefs. Perhaps it's just a brute given that we have moral knowledge and reliable moral experiences, and perhaps no more strides are able to be made beyond that. And I don't like that, but if that is the way the nature of reality is, to quote that great philosopher Ben Shapiro,
Oh man.
and just so the audience knows, I'm joking. I don't think Ben's a great philosopher. I'm not trying to throw him under the bus.
But
Facts
he's all
don't care. Facts don't care about your feelings, and reality doesn't care about our feelings either. If it's just a brute given that we have true moral beliefs and that we have true beliefs at all, reality is not going to care whether or not we're able to make strides beyond that. And
yeah.
and I'm not trying to psychologize Wade, but Wade's position seems to be uncomfortable with the possibility that perhaps strides on these grand metaphysical questions might be impossible. And I actually think, once again, the fact that we have to have this conversation at all is better explained by my position that our minds weren't designed to obtain truth than Wade's position that says our minds were designed to obtain truth. And I leave the ball back in your court.
Yes. I mean, at this point, it would just kind of be like a
beating a dead horse.
Yeah.
And that would add more gratuitous evil. So,
more gratuitous evil and suffering. I like how you add more gratuitous in there, like occasionally.
That's fun. You got to sprinkle it in like some salt and pepper,
So, are there any other topics with respect to because we spent way too much time on mine. Like,
oh,
I'm
I
sorry.
know. We got to cut it out in the final edit. We'll have a director's cut, and then we'll have the audience edition. No, I think we covered a lot of good ground on both of our arguments. I think it's best that we maybe proceed to maybe what we think of our own arguments, or how we would answer our own arguments, something along those lines.
This will be really fun. I'm so excited for this.
Can I start by saying that I do think your arguments work, generally speaking. Generally, I would say that a theodicy is needed for both of them.
Yeah.
I do think that it's at least intuitively shocking. It seems intuitively shocking that I keep throwing the word gratuitous, but we'll use it. Gratuitous ignorance and gratuitous moral disagreement would exist if our cognitive faculties and moral faculties were designed by God. I think you would agree with that. At least first glance, that seems kind of weird. That's a little bit weird. Like,
I'm not gonna lie, my mind literally blanked out for a second. Can you like repeat the last
No,
sentence?
I was saying I think you would probably agree that, at least at first glance, saying that God designed us to have, generally reliable cognitive faculties, and he also designed our moral faculties, and yet gratuitous ignorance and gratuitous moral putting all of those things together does seem, at least at first glance, there seems to be some tension. I won't say contradiction, but there definitely does seem to be intuitively some tension. I think you would agree with that.
Yeah.
And I honestly, all that you would need is to say, again, similar to our talk about the problem of evil last week, God made us good. He made humans. I was talking about nature last week. I'll talk about humans now and how my theodicy actually applies to humans. Okay. God made humans good, but humans aren't perfect. Like, only God is perfect. And by necessity, we're going to get things wrong. Yeah. Even if we were made good, even if we were designed to obtain truth, because we're finite, because we're not God, and because God's not going to step in every time we have moments of rational ignorance or moral ignorance, I think you can reasonably predict that humans will be ignorant, maybe even gratuitously ignorant. Um,
Yeah.
and also, I think you could reasonably predict that we'll have moral disagreement, perhaps even gratuitously moral disagreement.
Yeah.
So I would actually say that my theodicy from last week actually nicely ties together with your two arguments, or at least as giving an answer for the objections that I gave in my rebuttal, if
Yeah.
that makes sense. I think theodicy actually can give an account for the objections that I placed against your arguments.
Yeah.
I'm curious on that.
That's so interesting. So, I mean, the defense I gave, the reason I didn't spend much time on the theodicy thing is because I really actually do like this whole thing about the how much disagreement do we actually have. I think it actually comes up when Christians are talking to me about like arguments for morality and stuff, and they're like, "There's so much, like disagreement. Like, how do you know that this your naturalistic framework accounts for it?" And I'm like, "Well, how much disagreement is there actually?" And it's difficult because like I mean there is a high burden of proof that I'm like putting on my back. That burden of proof is that every person that has ever existed, like meaningfully called a human, whatever that means, and will exist, will probably have reliable cognitive faculties, and that's really heavy. But I think psychology can make some strides in that
Sure.
direction.
I wouldn't want to bite the bullet to say that, like, you seem comfortable, like, not dismissing, but not being as bothered by reality of moral disagreement.
Yeah.
I would just say that morality, in a way that morality is analogous to God, in that morality is very hard. Like, the facts of morality are hard. Like, if they're necessary truths
Yeah.
and we're finite, there's going to be some difficulty in sometimes grasping, I think,
Okay.
what the truths are. And I think you could, just as it's
I kind of like that.
like, well, also stop and think about this. I think you and I would both be at least tentative realists about scientific theories, that our scientific theories can make progress at
Yeah.
interpreting the natural world in an objective way
With time.
with time.
Yeah.
Well, even if
Yeah, I'm sorry. Like super duper side note. I had like a conversation with someone the other day about scientific realism and stuff, and he kind of started to push me in the direction of science is only about prediction, not truth. And like I don't know, I'm pushed slightly in the agnostic direction about that.
if naturalism is true, maybe I think actually you could give an interesting argument for scientific realism from theism, but that's a whole other conversation.
Okay.
Like, not exist, and he designed the world to be knowable. I think the success of science, or like the future success of science, is better explained by theism than that. But
Yeah.
perhaps we can say that the difficulties, we don't even have to assume scientific realism, but the difficulties of science are because interpreting the natural world's hard. That doesn't mean that a natural world doesn't exist. Likewise, interpreting a difficult moral law, or a complicated being like God, like it,
Mm-hmm.
the sheer reality of disagreement, I think it's just to be expected. I think it's a feature, not a bug, personally.
Yeah.
You might disagree with.
I mean, I see. Okay, so here's the thing. I think it might be a bug in this respect. I think if they're not really reliable, that does give a reason to kind of,
Oh no,
you
I
know,
do. I think they are reliable. I'm sorry, I meant to say I do agree with you that they are reliable. But the reason why we disagree is because the nature of what we're interpreting is complicated. That's what I was saying. Just like,
yeah,
let's say you and I were English students in a Shakespeare class, and we're assigned, like, we're assigned a portion of Hamlet, and we're both expected to provide our interpretation of Hamlet to our prof. And let's say you and I have radically different interpretations of what we think Shakespeare was saying in Hamlet. Does that mean that that Hamlet doesn't exist as a play? Well, no.
yeah,
It just means that sometimes literature is complicated in interpreting. And it's not even necessarily because Shakespeare was a bad author, but sometimes good literature requires you to think a little bit.
yeah. Hmm.
Perhaps that's the way reality is, and perhaps that's a feature, not a bug. And I guess intuitions will just differ on that. Like,
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I just agree with that, like full stop. I mean, so I think actually, when it comes to our actual worldviews, I wonder about it being a feature. But that aside, no, like, I mean, yeah, I think it was kind of a picture where it's like we have reliable cognitive faculties, but there's a lot of fog. There's a lot of things that happen in our life that make it complicated for us to see this. And actually, like, a lot of maybe aesthetic facts and moral facts can only be seen upon investigation. So, like, maybe you read this Hamlet thing, and maybe it's beautiful to you. Maybe you really, derive meaning from it. And then you look closer and you see even more meaning in it that you would have never seen if you didn't look closer. And that's kind of an interesting point. Yeah, I mean, so I think both of us might be in agreement that, like, there's not as much cognitive disagreement as we think there is. There's just a lot of fog in the way, and that can be
Yeah,
accounted for by theism, but I don't know if it's a feature of theism. But
that would be we would end up having more 2 hours on that. So,
yeah,
and perhaps we could talk about that in another podcast.
yeah,
But with respect to my arguments, why, if I thought they worked, I probably would be, I wouldn't be a Christian. I wouldn't be a theist.
yeah,
So the reason why I don't think they work, I think the God world argument is under the one of the presuppositions of the God world argument that I just disagree with is that making imperfect finite creatures would somehow be a degradation.
yeah.
I
Yeah,
just,
I wrote that.
I think intuitions will just vary on that. Someone will say, well, like, obviously it's a degradation. And that, to me, I think the implications of that are almost antinatalist in
okay.
their reality. Because no, what is one of the antinatalist arguments? It's that it's not worth creating more creatures because it's going to add more suffering to the world,
Yeah,
and things like that. And why would you want to do that, even if there are good? So the antinatalist argument assumes that there's degradation in bringing
yeah,
a more conscious life, and I just don't share that intuition. I think that even though humans are imperfect and finite, I think we can see through intuition that humans have value, and I think you and I would both agree with that. That
yeah,
there is value in us, even though we're not perfect. I think of the quote from Vision and Age of Ultron, where he's like, a thing isn't beautiful because it lasts. I think we see
yeah,
that there is beauty even in our finitude and imperfections. But another thing, I would have trouble answering my argument if I wasn't a Christian. If I had a concept of God that wasn't Trinitarian, I think I'd have more trouble answering my argument because
okay.
Richard Swinburne, in his book, I think it's The Christian God, he talks about how one of God's great making properties, and I'll explain to the audience what great making property is. Essentially, a great making property is just it's a feature that makes someone or something great. Let's say that, I was trying to talk about Wade's great making properties. If I were to say Wade is creative, Wade is kind, Wade is thoughtful, these would all be great making properties about Wade. But if I said Wade is selfish, Wade is irrational, Wade is a liar, there's an obvious difference between the different attributes I've just attributed to Wade.
Yeah.
So Richard Swinburne argues that if the Christian God exists, that he, she, however you want to talk about that, has all of the maximal amount of great making qualities. And Swinburne argues that a great making quality that God would have would be generosity. He would be maximally generous. And if you take that with his maximal love, the reality of creation is not a question of will there be a creation, but rather when. Because God is so maximally generous, maximally loving, a creation will flow out of that, not out of necessity or lack, but of want, a desire
Yeah.
to share love. Not out of necessity or lack, but out of want,
Okay.
because it has the great making property of, we'll say omni generosity or whatever. But I think that makes sense in a Trinitarian context where you have three persons who are sharing in love with each other for all of eternity, and all that other stuff. So I would say I
Yeah.
struggled with that argument if I wasn't a Trinitarian. I'd be really curious how, like, a general theism or even like a Jewish philosopher or a Muslim philosopher would address that. But yeah,
Yeah.
my thoughts on the first argument.
No, yeah, I think honestly, like that was actually a complicated argument to respond. By the way, so we send each other our arguments beforehand, but not the rebuttals. So we had did we send the rebuttal?
No,
No,
we didn't. So that
no,
was all freestyle.
that was freestyling. But the first week we prepared responses. So when I was preparing the response to the first, it actually gets very like metaphysically complicated very fast. Like so, I think the philosophy of time really matters here. Like I mean, it's not as if God exists. I used in the debate like time one and time two, and I don't know how else to use it. Like ontological
Well,
moment.
there are also debates on whether or not if God exists, if he's timeless or not, which is also
Yeah.
complicated. I don't even
So,
want to begin to touch that.
well, like presumably a perfect being might actually be timeless,
Yeah, that's true. Maybe.
and so the thing is like he exists with creation. There's no sense in which he exists before creation, in an ontological sense, but not in a temporal sense, right? So, like, I mean, I think it's like it flows out of him
Yeah, no,
necessarily.
perhaps it's like there's an eternal creation, perhaps. But from our time-bound perspectives, it appears to be creation ex nihilo or something.
Yeah.
But in reality, God exists eternally as creator
Yeah.
or something along those lines. Which Ryan Mullins, the philosophical theologian, would actually argue that's an argument against classical theism.
Okay.
But again, that's a whole other no, because Christians have historically held to creation ex nihilo, like creation is out of nothing, God created out of nothing, and Mullins argues that if classical theism is true, then if God truly is timeless, then you end up with and there's no succession in God's life, then you end up with something like eternal creation, and a lot of Christians have not felt comfortable with that. So again, no, your intuitions there are perfectly compatible with classical theism, but
Yeah.
they might not be compatible with certain types of Christian theism. But
So
some Christian theists would actually give pushback on that too, because they're like, well, no, for this reason and another. Anyway,
yeah. Oh man, what was I gonna? Um. No. Okay. That point about God needing something, that actually is kind of that's persuasive. I think that's a really good response. I think I think it's possible to understand God needing something in terms of it just wasn't possible for him to have it at moment one, but it is now. So he's going to adopt that newfound possible value, I suppose, right? You know what I mean? That might be something that might work.
I think it would work if the kind of theism that we had arguing for isn't true. Like if you have like a finite, like no, like and there are um, people who argue like for finite concepts of theism where no, like and it has explanatory power. Why did God create? Because he was lacking something. He wanted to. He was low. He could. There was a poem. It's like when God was lonely. Like maybe God, who however you want to cash God out, isn't the way Anselm described him, and could have been lacking something. And so I don't hold that, but
Yeah.
and so creates to have a relationship that he was lacking, and that could be an argument for like a finite version of theism. Like I don't hold that, but it could be actually perhaps an argument against um, Anselmian theism, and maybe an argument for finite theism, not necessarily an argument for atheism.
I wonder if we have to throw out the perfect being, though. I mean, I do really like this conception of maximal possible value. And, like, if we understand moment to be non temporal, plausibly, there are moments when certain kinds of value are not possible for God, but there are moments when they are, right? So when he goes into the next moment, right, there are new kinds of value possible, and so God adopts them because of his perfection. It's not as if a previous moment he was participating in less value than possible. It's not, it's not like he was less than perfect in that moment. Um,
I just worry that view creates want or lacks or creates lacks in God.
but
Um,
that's not a problem for perfection, though, because
I guess it just depends on how you want to cash out perfection as well.
yeah,
If because there theists who talk about God is um perfectly satisfied within himself. Like he lacks nothing. Like he lacks there's nothing that's incomplete about who God is. Like he has perfect satisfaction within himself or herself itself. And I think your view would seem to introduce well, no, that's not actually true. He's not perfectly satisfied within himself. He actually has these lacks. And some might not see that as an imperfection, but some might. Like I I
yeah.
I I could say I guess my last thought on this, and I'll leave it to you. It would just depend on what you consider perfection to be, and
I think yeah.
perhaps just intuitions are just going to be too What's the
Yeah, I think this talk of moments gets a little bit abstract and hard to grasp, and I think at that point it's like philosophical shooting in the dark
Oh
somewhat.
yeah, no, it's yeah. Well,
So
I mean, again,
yeah,
intuitions on these things are really complicated because, for instance, and I don't want to take this too off track, like the debates on whether God's timeless or not timeless. Classical theists have an intuition that say any kind of change is either for
yeah,
the better or for the worse. And non-classical theists go, no, that's not true. When like a clock changes, it's changing accordingly to the hour that it is. Like if it's 3 o'clock
yeah.
and it doesn't change to 4 o'clock when it's 4 o'clock, that's a bad clock. Likewise, they would say if God does have changes, it would be something. Again, it's not a perfect analogy, but they would say they would be perfect. And I'm an agnostic about whether I'm a classical theist or not. Depends on the day you catch me. But again, I say all of that to say that sometimes intuitions on these issues will be very complicated, and I
Yeah.
can see why differing intuitions would pop up.
Yeah. Okay, I mean, I think we can leave it at that for your part. Unless you want to say something else about other.
I just wanted to say something about religious ambiguity, but
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
no, sure. I'll say something quick about that. Um, religious religious ambiguity is only a problem if it's a problem if you hold to a theism. Last week in my everybody listened to the podcast I did with Wade last week. Um,
Yeah. If not, listen to it now. Turn
listen,
off this
just
podcast and come
yep,
back.
and just go back. But last week, Wade and I talked about whether or not people need to have explicit knowledge of God in order to be in a relationship with God. Um, and I think you could translate, or you could take that line of thinking and ask a similar question: does one need to have specific religious beliefs about God in order to be rightly related to God? And there are many
Yeah.
theists who say, oh, absolutely. If you don't have Islamic belief X about God, or Jewish belief X about God, or Christian belief X about God, that's it, you're done. And whatever hell is going to be, whatever hell is, that's where you're going. But if you hold the belief that I argued for last week, that it is possible to have knowledge, relational knowledge about God that isn't necessarily expressed propositionally, like a baby's knowledge of their mother, perhaps that same line of thinking can be applied to religious ambiguity. So let's say something like, Christianity is true, possibly, plausibly, one could be rightly related to Christ the way a child is rightly related to their mother, um, without having specific propositional knowledge about Christ. Maybe they express it as like, a Buddhist, a Hindu, Muslim, whatever. If that's plausible, then religious ambiguity is no longer a problem. But I think it is a problem if what I stated before is correct. That being, um, if you have to have, if religious view X about God, and if you don't have that correct view, you're done, son. Like that would be more of a problem. Or we could just take the approach you go and just go, well, maybe religion isn't the way that God wants to relate to us.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think interestingly, what you said, this would have been a really good response if I would have thought about it before. But like what you said about, I kind of did mention the thing about people not knowing that God exists, but like God may not need them to know that God exists. All He needs them to do is do good things and to know things about meaning. And I'm thinking if something similar can apply to morality. Like, I mean, I don't know if you have to have propositional knowledge of moral facts to act morally and be a good person.
I would agree with that. I would agree with that
Yeah.
100%. Because, perhaps we can think of some undescribed or undiscovered culture that doesn't even have a word, doesn't have moral in their vocabulary, or they
Yeah.
like moral vocabulary for how they live their lives, and yet they live moral lives, even though they're lacking the proper vocabulary to even describe what they're doing. Like,
Yeah.
would we say they're immoral people because they don't have the vocabulary to describe what
Yeah.
they're doing? Like, no, like they don't have knowledge like of Kant's categorical imperative, but they may live out Kant's categorical imperative.
Yeah, and I'm thinking specifically of a situation where maybe someone just really, really, really wants the well-being of someone else, but they don't know. that's a good thing. They
Yeah,
just want so badly,
and like
and that's it. Full stop. You know?
there are cultures where I was in a class once and they talked about there was a culture they were translating the Bible for or whatever, and they didn't have the word love in their vocabulary,
Yeah.
and
Okay.
so they had to define love or explain love to these people through illustration, not
Hmm.
necessarily through definition. And perhaps there are people who know moral truth through illustration and not necessarily through definition. And yeah, no, that'd be
Yeah.
that'd be a very interesting podcast in and of itself about the nature of moral knowledge and what kind
Yeah.
of knowledge and
Yeah, no, I think yeah, it's interesting because the whole thing I just said about the moral thing, it like especially applies to your argument because um it applies to like destiny and meaning, not just like with respect to God's existence, but like questions of meaning and stuff. You don't have to have propositional knowledge of questions of meaning or purpose or any of these other things, even though you might be properly related to it in the right
yeah.
way or
And you
uh,
didn't this, but there's even a soul building response that could be given, where perhaps one could say that God has taken an epistemic distance, or God approaches creation from an epistemic distance, and because of that, religious diversity emerges. But God sees value in maybe a Buddhist, a Hindu, a Muslim, and a Christian trying to lovingly sort out these issues in like a team building,
yeah.
kind of like like an office team building exercise. But he sees
Yeah.
value in the disagreement. Now the pushback could be, well, yeah, that's fine on paper, but look at the Crusades, look at 9/11, like what's valuable about that? And one could simply say, like in the free will defense,
Yeah.
that's
Hmm.
the fault of free will, not necessarily the religions themselves or the ambiguity itself. Like we could say it is obvious that love your neighbor is more obvious than an exegesis of the Quran or the Bible. And
Yeah.
perhaps God wants us to freely come to the belief of love your neighbor, and he wants to do that while at the same time being at epistemic distance, and perhaps because of that he values love your neighbor more than necessarily correct religious beliefs, and thus voila, religious diversity emerges.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's super. That's very interesting. Yeah. Do you have any other thoughts
No,
about?
no, the floor is all yours.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I think honestly we've discussed a lot of the. It's interesting because like our arguments like converged in different ways, and so like they
Oh
were
yeah,
related
I
to more
liked that
topics.
a lot. I like
Yeah,
that a
that
lot.
was so. It made it super flowy. No, okay. So I think I guess I can just talk about like what I think about my own arguments. Let's see if I can find them here. We're even. Um. Yeah. So the cognitive faculties are generally reliable. So this one just persuades me. This is what I did here for the audience, and I know John knows this. I took Plantinga's argument against naturalism, spun it to an argument for theism. So does he do that? Does he spin it for an argument for theism?
I think so. Yeah, I think he does argue in one of the Warrant books. Like he has 3 different books on Warrant. Like
Yeah,
if our cognitive, like God is the best explanation behind proper functionalism, or
yeah,
the view that our cognitive faculties were designed to obtain truth. And he argues that if our cognitive faculties are part of the design plan, and that design plan it entails our brains were designed to obtain truth. Well, what best explains the design plan?
yeah,
Yeah, no, so yeah,
yeah.
so he does.
No,
He does. I can't think of where he does explicitly in the Warrant trilogy, or maybe in responses to other people. For what it's worth, there are atheist philosophers who try to argue what Wade was saying, like atheistic proper function. But to be honest, I should have read more up on them. I probably would have been able to
yeah,
give a response. But yeah, no,
yeah,
there is an argument there for God.
yeah. Also, I should give a side note. This thing, we're using Riverside, by the way, the audience. This thing ends at 2 hours, so maybe we can, if the conversation picks up again, we can start a new thing. Like maybe we could try to wrap it up with the 2 hour mark, or something.
How
Um,
far how far are we into this?
an hour and 54.
All right.
Okay.
Um, you want to start
So
something
if we need to, we can start something else. We can
for
start a
sure?
new one. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So this argument persuades me. But like, so I have a picture in general about the effectiveness of arguments and maybe the effectiveness of philosophy. I love philosophy. It's one of my deep rooted passions. I'm skeptical of the utility of it, but I'm like John's persuading me more and more by the day of like yeah it works. So the way I think about things, I'm not persuaded of things because of arguments necessarily. Sometimes I am, sometimes I'm not. This is one of those that persuades me in a debate. I'd be like, yeah, it's a good argument. In real life, I don't think about it. You know what I mean? So I don't have a response. What I gave was a good, I think it's a good argument. One maybe slight thing I might say, I'm confused by design arguments in general. I'm like confused by Bayesianism, and I'm confused about theory comparison and stuff. Even though I feel like I get some of it, I'm just anyway. With moral experience, same thing. It's persuasive. I think so. Me and John have had conversations about moral realism. I would never reject moral premise two, the premise that if humans have moral experience, God exists. I think that was the premise John contested. But I would, if I were to reject this argument, which I might reject premise one that humans have moral experience. I don't think it's a thing. Sometimes I think it's a thing. Other times I don't. But there's the kind of simplicity in we just have tastes, and that's it. And so I might pull that card against my argument, but it wouldn't. This is why John's such a good like thinker and debater because he could have pulled that card, but that conversation would have ended in 5 minutes. So, so it's not an interesting conversation to have. But that's what I would. It would be interesting, but it just wouldn't be like productive. I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, the conversation about moral realism, just so the audience knows, Wade is wrong and being skeptical of moral
Wait,
realism.
is he?
Yeah, he's wrong.
Yeah. He's
We
an
know,
atheist. I
just
mean,
so
come
the
on.
audience knows, our moral intuitions are generally reliable. They do get things wrong from time to time.
Boo, boo.
But just so the audience knows, God does exist, and He designed you to know moral truths.
Boo.
Sometimes, because we live in an imperfect world, and sometimes we aren't always as virtuous as we think. Sometimes we
I
have.
did a video on that.
You did. You
Go
should watch.
check it out.
Sometimes we have moral disagreement. Sometimes we have, imperfect moral knowledge, and it's not because God doesn't exist or because moral realism is false. It's just that interpreting reality is sometimes hard. But anyway, that's a whole other conversation for another day.
Yep.
How much time do we have left?
So I don't want to be on a clock because we can always like do more, but I mean we have like 3 minutes just for this recording. But I mean honestly, I think we've kind of like I mean maybe what were some of my response unless you had something else to say.
Oh no, I think we covered a lot of ground.
Yeah, I was gonna quickly look at maybe my responses to what you said, but I honestly think we covered them because we talked about that God world thing and the religious ambiguity. I think there may be a few points here that I didn't say. No. Yeah, that's honestly pretty much it. Like I think we covered literally every base that we've yeah.
I guess the last thing I'll say is that interpreting reality is difficult. It is complicated, whether theism is true or atheism is true. And one of the places where it wasn't heated, but where we had a lot of pushback for each other was the idea of every worldview has brute facts that we have to appeal.
Yeah.
And I just, for my Christian friends who are going to be watching this, who go, well, atheists are, they're immoral and they're stupid dummies and all that other stuff.
True that.
Why is God triune, my Christian friends? Why is God triune? I don't know. Like, I'm a Christian. I'm going to say, I don't know why God's triune. He just is. Like, necessarily. He just is. But for, not necessarily for Wade, but for some skeptics, that doesn't fly. Like, that seems like a brute fact that requires more explanation. And perhaps if you're like, you're wondering why your apologetic arguments don't work for with your atheist friends, it might just be that, they have things that they think are just brute facts that don't require further explanation. Perhaps a further explanation isn't required, and that's not something unique to atheism. Is my only point. Christianity has brute facts as well. Why is God triune? I don't know. And so there are going to be places where every worldview will have to appeal to brute facts.
Yeah. And I guess like a final thing I would say, there's a philosopher named Josh Rasmussen. He's a philosopher of religion, and he kind of has hope that maybe there's a theory that explains a whole lot. Maybe it doesn't explain like literally everything, but he kind of has this principle where like explain as far as you can go. And I kind of have this hope that maybe we can have a theory that explains everything. What explains God, His perfection. I don't know. Like I mean, yeah, that's where I would stop. I guess.
I guess
Have any?
I would say is one of the reasons why I'm a Christian, one of the reasons why I'm a theist, is I believe reality is knowable. Though we get aspects of reality wrong, to piggyback off of Wade's first argument, the reason why our cognitive faculties are generally reliable is because a good God, I think it is a simpler theory to say, a good God made them, and he made us with these faculties because he wants us to know reality. And I think the last thing I'll say is, I think, just to leave it as a side note, if theism's true, I believe progress can be made in philosophy. And that's,
Yeah.
and it's because of your first argument, because God designed us with our cognitive faculties that are capable of knowing truth, because he's good and because he wants reality to be known, or he wants us to know reality because he is the ultimate source of reality. Anyway.
Yeah. So do you have any other final thoughts?
That's it.
Okay, well, thank y'all so much for listening. We're definitely going to have John back on for more conversations, hopefully one about free will. We actually had a 5-hour conversation a few weeks ago on will, so I'm sure we could have another 5-hour conversation on free will. No, but yeah, thank you so much, John. It's been fantastic.